Good evening. Let us look more carefully at what is happening here tonight, because if you have read the headlines, you already know the surface story, and the surface story is not what this is actually about. The headline tells you Sweden is delivering 150 JAS 39 Gripen fighter jets, that the Russian Air Force is in crisis, that Vladimir Putin is trembling. That is the language of a press release. That is not the language of strategy. And if you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that whenever a Western headline reaches for that kind of triumphalist simplicity, a deeper and far more complicated story is hiding directly underneath it. Tonight, we are going to find that story. Tonight, we are going to pull the lens back from the cockpit and look at the entire architecture of what is unfolding, because what Sweden has just done is not merely a weapons transfer. It is a civilizational signal, and the consequences of that signal will extend decades beyond the conflict currently burning in Ukraine. So let me ask you one question before we go any further. What does it actually mean for a neutral country? A country that spent 193 years avoiding military alliance, that built its entire post-Napoleonic identity around armed neutrality, to suddenly place 150 of its most advanced combat aircraft into the hands of a nation at war with a nuclear power. What does that tell us not about Sweden's generosity, not about Ukraine's need, but about the fundamental recalculation occurring inside the strategic mind of Northern Europe right now? That is the question. And that question has an answer that most of the commentary you will read this week will never reach. Stay with me tonight. If the analysis on this channel has helped you see the deeper structure of world events before, consider subscribing now, because what we are going to walk through this evening is exactly the kind of layered strategic reality that the news cycle cannot hold. Let us begin by rejecting the frame entirely. The mainstream coverage of this story is organized around a simple narrative: Sweden good, Russia bad, Ukraine strengthened, Putin humiliated. That framing is emotionally satisfying and strategically illiterate. It treats this transfer as an endpoint, as a conclusion, as if dropping 150 fourth-generation multi-role fighters into an active war zone simply resolves the air power equation, and the story is over. It is not over. In fact, the delivery of the Gripen fleet may be the moment when the air war over Eastern Europe becomes structurally more dangerous, not less. Not because Sweden is wrong to act, but because the Russian military doctrine that governs its response to air superiority threats was written long before Sweden was a NATO member, long before Nordic airspace became an integrated defensive corridor, and long before the Kremlin had to confront the possibility that its air defense umbrella, already under severe attrition from Ukrainian drone campaigns and Western-supplied anti-radiation missiles, now faces a qualitative jump in the offensive threat it must absorb. The story is not about whether Russia is doomed. The story is about what Russia does when it believes it is being cornered. That is a very different story. Now let us build this out layer by layer, because the strategic architecture here is unusually dense, and most analysts are only engaging with the first or second floor of a building that has 6. The first layer is the aircraft itself. The JAS 39 Gripen is not a glamour fighter. It does not carry the cultural weight of the F-16, it does not project the raw power mythology of the Su-57, and it does not inspire the geopolitical theater of the Eurofighter Typhoon. What the Gripen does is something far more tactically valuable for Ukraine's specific operational context. It is cheap to operate, requiring roughly 110 flight hours of maintenance per 1 hour of flight time, compared to the F-16's approximately 220 hours of maintenance per flight hour. It is designed to operate from short, improvised runways, including Swedish highways, which means it was engineered from the ground up to survive the kind of infrastructure destruction that Russian cruise missile doctrine deliberately targets at the beginning of any sustained air campaign. It carries the Meteor Beyond Visual Range air-to-air missile, which, as of 2024, holds the longest no-escape zone of any active air-to-air weapon in the world, with a range exceeding 150 kilometers and a ramjet sustainer that maintains terminal velocity throughout the entire engagement envelope. That last detail matters enormously because it means Russian pilots in Su-35S and Su-30SM aircraft cannot simply run. They cannot use the standard Russian tactic of launching at range and diving for the deck. The Meteor follows them all the way down. That is not a marginal upgrade for Ukraine. That is a structural change in what Russian pilots are willing to do over contested airspace. The second layer is the numbers. 150 aircraft sounds large. It is large in the context of Ukraine's current air force, which by most credible open-source assessments had been reduced to somewhere between 50 and 80 operational fighters by mid-2024, a figure that continued to decline through 2025 as attrition, parts shortages, and Russian seed operations took their toll. 150 Gripens delivered over the course of 18 to 24 months, as the confirmed logistics schedule suggests, would represent a tripling of Ukraine's fixed-wing combat capacity at minimum. But here is the layer beneath the numbers. Sweden does not currently have 150 Gripens to give. As of the 2024 Swedish Defense Commission report, the Swedish Air Force operated approximately 60 Gripen CD airframes in active service, with an additional order of 60 Gripen E variants under accelerated production at Saab's Linköping facility. The figure of 150, therefore, is not an inventory transfer. It is a production commitment. It is Sweden and its industrial partners telling the world that they are prepared to build, deliver, and sustain a Gripen fleet for Ukraine at a pace that would represent the single largest expansion of European fighter production since the Cold War. That is not a weapons shipment. That is a declaration of industrial posture. The third layer is NATO integration. Sweden formally joined NATO in March 2024, becoming the 32nd member of the alliance and completing the transformation of the Baltic Sea into what Finnish and Swedish military planners had for decades privately called a NATO lake, a body of water surrounded almost entirely by alliance members, with Kaliningrad as the single Russian naval enclave. The significance of that geographic reality for the Gripen transfer is this: the maintenance, training, intelligence support, and operational sustainment of 150 Gripens in Ukraine will not be conducted in isolation. Swedish Air Force personnel, Norwegian maintenance contractors, Danish avionics specialists, and almost certainly American electronic warfare integration teams will be involved in building the infrastructure that keeps this fleet operational. NATO membership means that Sweden's commitment to Ukraine's Air Force is structurally backed by the alliance's collective logistics capacity. Russia is not facing Sweden. Russia is facing Sweden plus Article 5. That is a fundamentally different threat calculus. The fourth layer is what this does to Russian air defense doctrine. Russia has spent considerable strategic energy and material resource since 2022 building what military analysts call an A2AD bubble, an anti-access area denial envelope, over-occupied Ukrainian territory, and the Western approaches to Russian airspace. That bubble is anchored by S-400 Triumph batteries, layered with Pantsir S-1 and Tor M2 short-range systems, and supported by a network of ground-based radar installations that extend from Crimea northward through Zaporizhzhia and into Luhansk Oblast. The Gripen's electronic warfare suite, particularly the Saab Electronic Warfare Advanced System known as EWAS, is designed specifically to operate inside contested A2AD environments. More critically, the integration of the Gripen's sensor suite with NATO's existing ISR architecture, specifically with American E-3 Sentry AWACS platforms and the new Boeing E-7A Wedgetail aircraft entering NATO service, means that Ukrainian Gripen pilots will be flying with a common operational picture that no Soviet-era or even modern Russian fighter currently deployed to the theater can match. They will know where every Russian aircraft is. Russian pilots will not have the same certainty about them. That asymmetry in situational awareness is not a minor advantage. In modern air combat, it is almost the only advantage that matters. The fifth layer is the economic dimension, and this is where the story becomes genuinely alarming for Moscow in ways that have nothing to do with aircraft kill ratios. The Russian defense budget for fiscal year 2024 was officially declared at approximately 10.7 trillion rubles, roughly 117 billion US dollars at contemporary exchange rates, representing approximately 6% of Russian GDP and the highest military spending share in Russian post-Soviet history. That budget is under severe stress. The combination of Western sanctions, the exclusion of Russian financial institutions from SWIFT, the energy revenue compression caused by the price cap mechanism on Russian oil exports, and the sustained attrition cost of ground operations in Ukraine, which independent Russian economic analysts, including Alexandra Prokopenko, a former Central Bank of Russia advisor who fled Russia in 2022, have estimated at between 300 and 400 billion rubles per month in direct operational costs, means that Russia is funding a war of industrial attrition from a shrinking fiscal foundation. Sweden's 150 Gripen commitment adds a new dimension to that equation. Russia must now fund not just the defense of current front lines, but the accelerated production of sufficient air defense missile inventory to engage a qualitatively upgraded Ukrainian Air Force over a multi-year horizon. Each S-400 interceptor costs approximately $3 million. A single Meteor-armed Gripen engagement envelope can force the expenditure of multiple interceptors per sortie. Multiply that across a fleet of 150 aircraft conducting hundreds of sorties per month, and the math becomes genuinely punishing for a Russian defense industry already operating at maximum declared capacity. The sixth layer is the one no one in Western media is discussing, and it is the most important layer of this entire analysis. Sweden's commitment is a signal to China, not about Ukraine, about Taiwan. Since 2022, Beijing has watched the Western response to Russia's invasion with extraordinary analytical attention. The key question for Chinese strategic planners is not whether the West will impose sanctions or supply weapons to Taiwan in the event of a cross-strait operation. The key question is whether the West has the industrial capacity, the political will, and the structural resolve to sustain a high-quality military support commitment over a multi-year horizon against a nuclear-armed adversary. For the first 2 years of the Ukraine conflict, that question remained genuinely open. Western ammunition stocks were visibly depleted. F-16 deliveries were delayed by political hesitation and training timelines. The impression in Beijing, confirmed by multiple statements from PLA-affiliated analysts published in Chinese-language defense journals between 2022 and 2024, was that Western resolve was episodic, reactive, and ultimately limited by domestic political fatigue. Sweden's 150 Gripen production commitment disrupts that impression. It says that at least one NATO member is prepared to make a long-term industrial investment in a conflict outcome, not merely draw down existing inventory. That is a message Beijing cannot ignore. And the fact that the Gripen's design architecture is directly applicable to the kind of contested maritime air environment that a Taiwan Strait operation would create, short runway capability, advanced electronic warfare, beyond visual range missile integration, makes the signal even more pointed. Now let us move to the historical pattern, because this story has happened before. And understanding when it happened tells us something critical about how it ends. The year is 1940. Finland is fighting the Soviet Union in what history will call the Winter War, and then the Continuation War. Sweden, officially neutral, is watching its neighbor absorb Soviet air power in a conflict that will kill more than 85,000 Finnish soldiers. Sweden does not intervene militarily. It sends volunteers. It sends supplies. It sends humanitarian aid. It maintains its neutrality because the strategic calculation in Stockholm in 1940 is that Swedish intervention would trigger a Soviet response that Sweden cannot survive alone. That calculation holds for 83 years, until it doesn't. The lesson of that 83-year neutrality is not that Sweden was cowardly or indifferent. The lesson is that Swedish strategic restraint was always conditional, always rational, and always based on a specific threat threshold. What Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine did was cross that threshold. It demonstrated, in a way that no amount of diplomatic reassurance could overcome, that a major European power was prepared to use military force to redraw national borders by conquest. Once that demonstration was made, the entire logic of Swedish neutrality collapsed, not emotionally, strategically, because the premise of armed neutrality is that your deterrence posture is credible enough to make you not worth attacking. Once a neighbor demonstrates that it will attack regardless, deterrence alone is insufficient. Alliance becomes the only rational response. That pattern, the conditional neutrality that collapses when the threat threshold is visibly crossed, has repeated across European history with remarkable consistency. Switzerland maintains it today, though under increasing pressure. Austria maintained it through the Cold War. Ireland has maintained a version of it since independence. In each case, the neutrality holds precisely as long as the threat environment does not cross the specific threshold that makes neutrality strategically incoherent. Sweden crossed that threshold in 2022, and the 150 Gripens are the material expression of the new strategic identity that crossing that threshold produced. Now consider the historical parallel with the United States Lend-Lease program of 1941. Before Pearl Harbor, American law prohibited direct military involvement in the European War. Franklin Roosevelt's solution was industrial commitment without formal belligerency. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 authorized the transfer of war material to any nation whose defense the President deemed vital to American security. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States delivered approximately $50 billion in war material to Allied nations, equivalent to roughly $750 billion in 2024 terms. The strategic effect of Lend-Lease was not merely to supply weapons, it was to change the timeline of the conflict by ensuring that the industrial capacity of the United States was structurally committed to the Allied outcome before American soldiers were ever deployed. Sweden's Gripen commitment operates on the same logic. It is not Sweden going to war. It is Sweden committing its industrial and military aerospace infrastructure to a specific strategic outcome, the preservation of Ukrainian sovereignty, in a way that changes the long-term attrition calculus regardless of what happens on any given day at the front. There is one more historical parallel that carries uncomfortable implications. In the spring of 1950, the United States made the strategic decision to provide significant military assistance to France's war in Indochina. By 1954, American material was funding roughly 80% of the French war effort. The French still lost at Dien Bien Phu. The lesson is not that external military assistance cannot change outcomes. The lesson is that external military assistance cannot substitute for the internal political and military conditions that determine whether a war is winnable. The Gripen fleet makes Ukraine's air war more survivable. It does not resolve the fundamental questions of manpower, territorial depth, and political cohesion that will ultimately determine whether Ukraine can convert military resilience into a negotiated outcome on acceptable terms. Let us now examine the strategic consequences because they are unfolding on multiple levels simultaneously. The immediate consequence for Russia is accelerated pressure on its air defense missile inventory in precisely the threat axis where that inventory is already most stressed. The western and northwestern approaches to Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory are where Gripen operations will concentrate, leveraging the aircraft's short runway capability to operate from hardened dispersal sites in western Ukraine, potentially as far forward as the Lviv region, while maintaining the range to prosecute missions deep into the operational area. Russia will respond by deploying additional S-400 batteries from its strategic reserve, likely drawing from the Far Eastern Military District, which has the deepest reserve stocks. That redeployment, if it occurs at the scale that a 150 aircraft threat demands, will reduce Russia's air defense coverage along its Pacific approaches at precisely the moment when Japan is accelerating its own rearmament under its 2022 national security strategy, which committed Tokyo to spending 2% of GDP on defense by 2027. A figure that implies approximately $80 billion per year in Japanese defense investment by the end of the decade. Russia does not have the inventory depth to simultaneously face a qualitative air threat in the West and a rearmament surge in the East. That is a strategic dilemma, not a tactical problem. The medium-term consequence is what happens to the European fighter industrial base. Sweden's production commitment will require Saab to accelerate its Gripen E manufacturing line in ways that will reshape the entire European aerospace supply chain. GKN Aerospace, which manufactures Gripen fuselage components in the United Kingdom, will need to expand. Volvo Aero, which produces the Gripen's engine based on the General Electric F414, will need additional production agreements with GE's Lynn, Massachusetts facility. MBDA, the European Missile Consortium, will need to increase Meteor production to equip the delivered aircraft. That cascade of industrial expansion will generate employment, technology transfer, and manufacturing capacity across at least 6 NATO member states. It will create constituencies for continued defense investment in countries where defense spending has historically faced domestic political resistance. And it will establish production relationships that outlast any particular conflict, because industrial ecosystems, once built, are very difficult to dismantle. Now let us look at the scenario forecasting, because history rarely follows a single path, and intellectual honesty requires us to hold multiple futures simultaneously. The first scenario is the decisive air superiority scenario. In this outcome, the Gripen fleet, delivered on the confirmed 18 to 24-month schedule, is integrated successfully with Ukraine's existing command and control infrastructure and NATO's intelligence architecture. Ukrainian pilots, many of whom will have received transition training at Swedish and Norwegian facilities, achieve sufficient proficiency by the 18th month of delivery to conduct sustained air superiority operations over the front line. Russian air defense systems, already under attrition from Ukrainian drone campaigns and harm missile strikes, are unable to absorb the qualitative improvement in Ukraine's offensive capability. Russia's ability to conduct effective close air support for its ground forces degrades significantly. The front line stabilizes in Ukraine's favor. This scenario is optimistic but not impossible. It requires everything to work on schedule, which in the history of complex military logistics almost never happens. The second scenario is the Russian escalation scenario. In this outcome, Moscow interprets the Gripen commitment not as a manageable military development, but as a strategic threshold crossing. Specifically, the threshold at which Western industrial commitment to Ukraine's long-term air power crosses from tactical support into structural threat to Russian airspace sovereignty. In response, Russia intensifies its strategic bombing campaign against Ukrainian defense industrial infrastructure, targeting not just the front lines but the dispersal airfields, maintenance facilities, and fuel supply chains that a Gripen operation depends on. Russia may also escalate its covert operations against Swedish industrial targets, not through direct military action, which would trigger Article 5, but through the kind of hybrid sabotage campaign that has already been documented against European defense infrastructure, including the Baltic Sea cable cuts of late 2024 and the GPS jamming operations over Finnish and Estonian airspace that have been ongoing since 2022. This scenario is uncomfortably plausible. The third scenario is the negotiation pressure scenario. In this outcome, the Gripen commitment functions not as a battlefield tool but as a diplomatic lever. The announcement and the production timeline create a strategic clock in Moscow's calculations. Russian military planners will model the point at which Ukraine's air capability crosses the threshold where Russian air operations over the front become prohibitively costly. That modeling exercise may produce a political conclusion in the Kremlin that a negotiated settlement, locked in before the Gripens reach operational status, is strategically preferable to continuing the conflict into a qualitatively more dangerous air environment. In other words, the 150 Gripens may matter most not as aircraft that fly, but as aircraft that concentrate Russian minds before they ever leave the hangar. This scenario was the logic behind American Pershing II missile deployments in Western Europe in 1983, which produced not the nuclear confrontation that European peace movements feared, but the INF Treaty of 1987. The fourth scenario is the long war attrition scenario. In this outcome, neither side achieves decisive advantage. The Gripens arrive incrementally, are integrated imperfectly, face a Russian air defense adaptation that proves more resilient than Western analysts projected, and the war continues on its current trajectory of slow territorial grinding for another 3 to 5 years. In this scenario, the Gripen commitment matters primarily as a signal of endurance, not as a war-winning instrument. It tells Moscow that the cost imposition strategy, the bet that Western political fatigue would produce an arms supply cutoff, has failed, and the compounding of that signal, together with American ATACMS, British Storm Shadow, French Scalp, and now Swedish Gripen, produces not a decisive battlefield shift, but an erosion of Russian strategic confidence that eventually makes continued war politically unsustainable in Moscow. This is the most historically consistent scenario, because wars of attrition between large powers almost never end in a single decisive moment. They end when one side's internal political calculations conclude that the cost of continuation exceeds the value of the objective. Sweden's Gripen commitment makes that calculation harder for Moscow, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of strategic mathematics over time. Let us close tonight with the larger truth, because this is ultimately not a story about Sweden or about fighter jets or even about Ukraine. This is a story about a transformation in the world order that we are living through right now in real time and that most people are not yet equipped to name. What Sweden has just demonstrated is that the post-Cold War assumption of a stable, rules-based international order maintained by American hegemony and European collective passivity is over. Not weakened, not under stress, over. The countries of Northern and Eastern Europe, the ones who border Russia or share its history, have made a collective decision that their security cannot be outsourced to American political will, cannot be ensured by diplomatic norms, and cannot be deferred to institutions whose authority Russia demonstrated it would simply discard when convenient. They are rearming. They are committing industrial capacity. They are accepting the costs and the risks of being, as the Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson framed it in his 2024 address to the Riksdag, a nation with security obligations rather than security consumers. That transformation from security consumer to security producer is the civilizational shift that the 150 Gripens represent. And it is a shift that is not limited to Sweden. Finland has ordered 64 F-35s. Poland is building the largest land army in European history. The Baltic states are constructing a literal physical barrier, the Baltic Defense Line, along their borders with Russia and Belarus, at a combined cost exceeding 2 billion euros, the first permanent frontier fortification in Europe since the Cold War ended. History has seen this pattern before. In the 1930s, the democracies of Europe chose reassurance over rearmament, chose diplomacy over deterrence, chose the comfort of believing that the aggressor would eventually be satisfied. They paid for that choice in a way that no generation should be forced to pay. The generation now making decisions in Stockholm and Helsinki and Warsaw and Tallinn has read that history. They have drawn the lesson, and they are acting on it, not with noise, not with panic, not with the theatrical belligerence that bad actors always perform, but with the quiet, serious, expensive industrial commitment of nations that have decided they will not repeat the errors of their predecessors. That is what you are watching when you watch Sweden deliver 150 Gripen fighters. You are watching a civilization remember itself. If what you heard tonight made you think, if it challenged the frame you came in with, if it helped you see the deeper architecture of what is unfolding in Northern Europe and what it means for the decades ahead, please subscribe for ongoing analysis and share this video with someone who is still reading the headlines and missing the story. Now I want to ask you directly, which of the 4 scenarios we examined tonight do you believe is most likely and why? Leave your answer in the comments below. The discussion there is frequently more insightful than the video itself, and your perspective genuinely shapes what we examine next. Next week, we are going to look at something that connects directly to what we discussed tonight, a development in the Pacific that most Western analysts have completely misread, and that will require us to return to several of the structural patterns we identified this evening. Do not miss it.